28. Apple cider, other fruit wines, and vinegars. Are we drunk or just pickled? Hello, and welcome to the History of American Food. After stopping with solid apples last week, this week I'll be looking at all the ways apple juice specifically, and in a limited way, fruit juices generally played a role in 17th century American food. Cider and other fruit wines were the obvious one, but the role of apples in food preservation caught me off guard, making the apple adventure a two-parter. So pull up to your place at the table and let's dig in. First of all, as far as I can tell, except on pressing day, nobody was really drinking fresh fruit juices in the 17th century British colonies. As with milk, without pasteurization and refrigeration as we know it today, unfermented, sugary liquids like milk and fruit juice weren't sensible items. If you're wondering about milk being a sugary liquid, I'll get into that in the late 19th century, but in the meantime, check those nutrition labels. Back to the fruit juice. Apple juice mainly, as well as the juice of other early American fruits like the native grapes, currants, mulberries, and occasional stone fruits like peaches, cherries, and plums, all contributed sweetness, an alcoholic kick, and the power of preservation to the 17th century colonial pantry. Last week, I called out sweet or dessert apples, the kind that are good right off the tree. But apples were also labeled drying apples, and others were considered keeping apples. Those were all important kinds of apples, but the sort of apple that was grown the most and used the most was the cider apple. Before we get any further, I'm going to do a quick pass at the history of cider and what to call the fermented juice of non-apple fruits, since I'm including them in here, because they all go through essentially the same processes. When exactly and where exactly apples started getting made into cider is pretty fuzzy, because crab apples were everywhere and so was yeast. So cider, like bread, is one of those things that likely happened independently over and over and over again. But there were different early Central Asian, South Asian, and Southeastern European civilizations that made fruit juice fermentation a regular practice and a cottage industry. Fruit wines besides grape wines were clearly known to exist all around the Mediterranean, but grape was king, or emperor, or anyway, supreme fruit. So everything was kind of lumped together as strong drinks or an inferior sort of wine. When the Romans started wandering around Europe, heading north and west, setting up towns and having wine parties, using apples to make cider or apple wine was definitely well underway. And if there's one thing that puts a damper on a wine party, it's the lack of wine. The bad news is the best wine grapes don't just grow anywhere, and they require a good bit of care to keep bearing. So many a Roman was perfectly happy to make wine out of whatever. And apples weren't terrible. So as they set up bureaucracies and buried coins in their backyards, the Romans also brought improved apples, along with things like grapes and the more productive honeybees. Romans, or Roman colonial servants or slaves, depending on the era, knew that the same steps required to make grape wines work on any fruit you can squeeze juice out of. Step 1. Squeeze the juice out. Step 2. Set it in a mostly closed-off vessel until the sweetness is converted to alcohol. That meant it got fizzy, less sweet, and then stopped fizzing. Or as we know now, wild yeast got in there and started munching away at the sugar. Step 3. Store in a coolish place out of the light until it mellows a bit. Or drink it fresh. Anyway, ta-da! Wine. So technically, any yeast-fermented fruit juice is a type of wine. But of course, the Greek and Latin words for wine itself are related to the word vine, the structure the grape grows on. But over time, it has become a catch-all for any juice that is fermented in the same way. Of course, in places where grape wine was rare, other names for the most common fermented fruit drink could develop. And so we have modern names like cider for apple drinks. The reasonably close apple relative, pears, its tipsy juice is sometimes called perry or pear cider. In Europe, other than the two giants, grapes and apples, so much less of everything else was juice that all these extra items got called something cider. So plum cider or peach cider if they were less refined, and something wine like mulberry wine or cherry wine if they were served at fancy places like courts or the high tables of manor houses. In the end, cider or wine, it's all just marketing. So the Romans, as I have mentioned in the beer episode, preferred even inferior fruit wines over beer. At least cider, that is apple wine, was still made by the gods rather than brewed by mere humans as beer was, and barbarian humans at that. The claim is cider arrived with the Druids on the island of Britain. But regardless of who was responsible for it, cider from the native crabapples was definitely sloshing around Britain by 3000 BCE, well before any Romans showed up. But during the short time Romans were in Britain, they not only set up some vineyards, but also fruit trees around their villas. So the official, purposefully human-manipulated apples likely arrived with the Roman invasion in the 1st century CE. And cider burbled along with these new apple varieties alongside the other alcoholic brews of the Celtic tribes, mead and metheglin, both honey wines, and some sort of cereal grain-based beer. The next step in cider improvement appears to have arrived with the Norman conquest in the 11th century. These Northmen had particular cider tastes and brought their cider apple cultivars, which not only contain the acid and tannins needed for tastier cider, but higher sugar levels for a more alcoholic brew. Remember, the yeast needs sugar to turn into alcohol. The more sugar, the higher the final alcohol content can be, until the yeast kill themselves off with alcohol poisoning. The Normans seem to have also brought some specific cider technology, like orchard management, more grafting knowledge, brewing methods, and new cider presses. This improved apple wine or cider technology, it depends on how fancy you were, would come in very handy as the weather trended colder in the 16th century. The colder weather seems to have killed the local English wine industry, increased English cider and mead consumption, and activated that English resentment over spending good English silver on French wines and brandies. I talked about that a bit in episode 11 on mercantilism and the rise of New World piracy. Anyway, by the 16th century, cider and ale were the drink of the rustic landowner, peasant farmer, and the city-dwelling middling to lower sorts of the town. Beer with hops was gaining the upper hand, as were semi-industrial male-run beer concerns. The improved keeping ability of the hopped beer caused it to upstage cider in the towns, but cider remained present, and even became something of its own male-controlled industrial concern when cider was used as a naval store alongside beer, salt beef, dried fish, extremely salty butter, and hard biscuit. But when the first colonists arriving in New England found they could barely grow enough wheat and barley for bread, or not even enough of that, grain beers nearly vanished from the 17th century colonial scene. The corn and pumpkin beers were universally considered pretty dreadful, so as soon as significant apple crops began to develop, everyone was ready to reconsider cider. At this point, there weren't really any cider apples per se in the New World. Remember, these were not great farmers and were simply growing apples from seeds they had brought and hoping for the best. Rather, everything that wasn't specifically a dessert apple or drying or keeping apple was a cider apple. And a fair number of the sweeter, larger crab apples would be tossed into the cider category as well. The 17th century colonial cider apples were the hodgepodgeiest of all apples. And they also included the windfalls, or the ones that had already fallen off the trees, of all the other sorts. Truly rotten apples, the soft squishy ones, shouldn't have been included because those just made bad cider. But diaries about some of the colonial cider made it clear that sometimes rotten apples made their way in. Now, only sound apples with whole skins and no bruises or soft spots made the grade as a keeping apple. to be set in a barrel in a cellar or a barn. Things that didn't make the grade as keeping apples were sent to be dried or cooked. Anything that wasn't fit for dried apples or cooked apples, apples that would fall under the scratch and dent category or had the wrong flavor for the other categories, became a cider apple. When other non-apple fruits were also sorted, this is pretty much the same process they encountered. The sound stuff was dried or cooked, and the rest just juiced for cider. For the very best cider, which was mostly not what was being made, especially in the early 17th century, it was important that the juicing took place pretty quickly. First, since they were working with the scratch and dent and windfall fruits, there was already a ticking clock. Bashing and smashing the apples disrupted the cellular processes that make rot possible, as did soaking the apple flesh in the sugary, acid, and tannin-laden juice. The bacteria and cellular action needed functioning cells and access to oxygen. Breaking up the cells and submerging everything put a damper on the rotting action. Second, the acids and tannins are broken down and consumed by metabolizing apple cells. Remember the apples that get sweeter by sitting in barrels? So smashing up the apples keeps those acids and tannins intact. Now, those might make challenging eating experiences, but they're actually important for creating tasty fruit juice, especially alcoholic fruit juice. As brewers will discover in the 18th century, while it is super easy to ferment a straight sugar or molasses solution, the resulting taste is not that nice. Having some acids and tannins in the mix creates a better flavor than just alcohol and yeast byproducts. So if you were a 17th century colonist with a bountiful harvest of apples, just how would you have turned that into cider? Since apples are not grapes, the favored juice extraction method, stamping on the grapes with bare feet, was out. Apples in good shape for cider are too sturdy for that. Instead, it was time to get out the smashing sticks. Apples were typically smashed out of their nice, sturdy, spherical shapes with things like axe handles and mortars. The resulting slushy mess, or pomace, was allowed to sit for a few hours or overnight. We now know this allowed the yeast in the apples to get working on the juice and multiply. At the time, everybody just knew the cider worked better with this step. Once the juice and pulp had rested together, it was placed into bags of loosely woven fibers, often a combination of animal and human hair. These bags were twisted and squeezed into tubs to express the juice. A few cider presses were available at this point, but would not come into wide use until the 18th century, when they could be purchased using the cash crops that were just barely under development in the 17th century. After all, at this point, cider was mostly a household item and under the supervision of women. Investing in supporting machinery didn't happen until cider became a community and commercial trade item. These early ciders were generally very low in alcohol. To get at the greatest amount of sugar, thus the greatest amount of alcohol, the juice needed to sit on the lees, or the solids that were squeezed out of the pomace. Household cider generally spent very little time on its lees, as most 17th century households didn't have spare tubs and basins for just leaving things in. So the juice would likely have gone into some stoneware or crude pottery storage jugs or jars fairly quickly. If a home had enough cider, it would be barreled. Once in storage, the cider would be allowed to work or ferment for a while, and once the fizzing died down, it could be drunk or put away somewhere cool for later. Unlike beer, cider didn't need to be aged to become more drinkable. In fact, cider was often consumed very happily while it was still fermenting, and the effervescence, the slight fizz it had in this form, was considered both novel and refreshing. At the end of the 17th century, as grain cultivation picked up, greetings from Pennsylvania, cider would lose some ground to beer in areas where a good cellar could be dug, and there were people, mostly women, with the time and know-how to make it. In areas, especially the Chesapeake and South, where it was too hot to keep cider or beer for any length of time, and there weren't enough women, much less women with time to brew much beer, cider stayed on top. For beer brewing takes more time, more equipment, and more steps than cider brewing. Almost anyone, even you with a neglected, half-drunk bottle of apple juice in your car, can make a form of cider. Beer requires more purposeful actions, and let's face it, when everyone was running around doing everything to keep a roof over their heads, food in their bellies, and pay off their transport costs or indenture, the choice between growing an extra field of grain for beverage raw materials or just letting the apple trees do their thing in the tobacco-mad Virginia and Southern colonies, the lower effort apple trees were going to be the go-to option as a source for the daily tipple for a long time to come. Cider was drunk by everyone, men, women, and children for breakfast, lunch, and dinner. As with small beer, most of the cider had just enough alcohol to keep the worst of the creepy crawlies at bay for a limited amount of time, but not enough to get anyone seriously plastered. Some of the stronger cider would be set aside purposefully because it could keep longer for celebrations or to be sold in inns and taverns. But the low-alcohol sweet cider was the everyday drink, and in the age of terrible alternate no or low-grain beers was highly preferred. The short-keeping aspect of the cider meant it was a drink shared widely as a mark of generosity and conviviality, though because it literally could not be kept and was therefore given away, sweet cider would gain a bit of a reputation as rustic or what you give to those who are pitied, and it did lose some social standing. Because the only ingredient in cider and every other fruit, wine, or cider, whether apple or peach or cherry or whatever, was simply apple or peach or cherry or whatever, there was nothing there to stop it from going bad. By the 17th century, beer had hops and other herbs added to preserve it or to attempt to preserve it, but nobody did that with cider, so nobody expected cider to keep. That meant when cider reached the end of its tasty life, that is, it soured and wasn't really cider anymore, there was a plan for it. Like everything else in the 17th century colonies, even if it was done being one thing, it was about to become another thing. So the cider would become vinegar. Here in the post-germ theory world, we know about Acetobacter. That is, a variety of bacteria that specifically eats ethyl alcohol, or ethanol, the alcohol humans consume in ciders and wines and beers. When Acetobacter eats ethanol, it turns it into acetic acid. And acetic acid is the acid that is vinegar. Now, with fermentation, a brewer is working to produce conditions that encourage and favor yeast. Lots of different microscopic critters love sugar and are happy to turn it into all sorts of different products. So it's a challenge to let the right things, the good fermenting yeast, in and keep the wrong things, the molds and bacteria that produce bad tasting things and toxins that cause mild to severe poisoning, out. So temperature control and cleanliness are all pursued. The brews are monitored, handled gently, and catered to. But once you have alcohol in solution, the rules are different. I've casually talked about yeast doing themselves in through alcohol poisoning, and that is a thing that happens. When a fermented beverage gets to a certain ethanol percentage, alcohol does what alcohol does. It starts disinfecting, killing off microorganisms. That lethal percentage differs from critter to critter, but lots are vulnerable to alcohol concentrations around 5 to 9%. Some yeast have developed tolerances into the mid-teens, notably modern wine yeasts that produce alcohol percentages up to 15 to 18%. And a few yeast strains have been carefully cultivated to tolerate alcohol at even higher concentrations, over 25%. When alcohol approaches 30%, the liquid is approaching a distilled spirit and is impervious to rot. That means it is poisonous to any single cell invader. So any changes are due to aging, not cellular metabolism. We'll get much more into this when we talk about rum. When you have alcohol in solution instead of sugar, what can happen next is pretty limited. Back in 17th century cider and wine and beer land, they were never dealing with anything approaching the crazy alcohol tolerances of modern super yeasts. 10 to 12% was pretty much the high end. That meant there were usually some residual sugars and plenty of other little edible goodies floating around in these drinks. After time and exposure to air, something was going to get in and start multiplying. And the typical winner in these alcoholic drinks after everybody had done competing was the Acetobacter. This is due to the fact that while a variety of different microbes can deal with a little ethanol, the pH change, or messing around with how water behaves, is much harder to fight. An acid, any acid, but acetic acid in this case, lowers the pH of solutions. And this means there are loose hydrogen ions wandering around, causing havoc in molecular transactions. Enough messed up chemical reactions due to wandering hydrogen ions, and the cellular processes won't work. No cellular processes, and cells die. And since these microorganisms are single cells, they have no backup. And the Acetobacter has successfully done in all of its previous competition. At some point, I may go into the cool life cycle of vinegar and other bacterial and fermenting multicellular colonies, but that will either be a bonus episode or part of a future look at vinegar. For now, all that is important to know is Acetobacter wins and pretty much everything else loses. Because the Acetobacter does an even better job of killing off the competition than yeast does, it distinctly does not need to be babied. In fact, the less babying, the better for vinegar. So once a cider or beer or wine has been relegated to vinegar status, it gets largely ignored. Every recipe I found for 17th century or earlier vinegar says something along the lines of take the cider, etc., that has gone too sour, put it in a barrel in the corner, on its side, of course, bunghole up, place a tile over the hole, and this allows gases to escape easily and keeps out dust and bugs. Then ignore it for a year or so. If you're in a hurry, put it in the sun for a few months to speed things along. In other words, all those things you did to carefully make your alcoholic beverage of choice, don't do any of that. Also, expose it to heat and light, which, if you think about it for a bit, makes sense when you realize how many warm and hot weather cuisines have a strong vinegar thread running through them. If the vinegar was destined for cleaning or medicines or general pickling, then it was ready to go as soon as it was unbearably sour. Maybe dilute it, maybe add some spices if it was for a particular pickle. If the vinegar was for sauces and flavoring, well, there were all sorts of instructions for putting it away to mellow and age in a barrel for, well, just more time. But that sort of fancy fussing about rarely happened in the 17th century British Atlantic colonies. So at the end of all that, we arrive at the conclusion that rotten cider is the basis for cider vinegar. Oh, and in the 17th century, before they had figured out it was all acetic acid, the different agars had different names. The agar part is related to sour, so vinegar is literally sour wine. But the sour beer vinegar, that was classified as alegar. One comforting thing when it comes to spelling, as vowels are my downfall, nobody could agree how to spell alegar. It's one of those words that when I come upon a new spelling, I figure out, alegar, hey. Oh, and if you're curious to actually taste alegar, the toned-down version hangs out at fish and chip places as malt vinegar. In the next century, we'll get into flavored vinegars and shrubs or vinegar-flavored drinks. But for the 17th century, it's important to recognize that in the colonies, vinegar's main purpose was the extension of food life. Which brings us all the way back around full circle. Apples were meat and drink in the 17th century British Atlantic colonies. They were important as food and worked as lubricant for sociability, as low-alcohol drinks imbibed in communal and family settings generally do. But they were also an essential cog in creating early food stability for the colonists as pickling vinegar. And that is pretty clever. Harnessing the byproducts of microbial warfare for your social enjoyment and food preservation needs, even before you understand what is really going on and how exactly it's happening. That is some pretty great observational science. And don't forget, this technology was pioneered in the kitchen, not in the lab. Next week, I'll be looking at another round food that played an important supporting role in 17th century American food. Eggs. The colonial kitchen included chicken eggs, yes, but other eggs as well. We'll see what roles eggs, poultry, and fowl played in the 17th century food economy and briefly ponder the world pre-omelet. Thanks for listening. Show notes for this episode will be at thehistoryofamericanfood.blogspot.com. Along with the promised pictures and links, I'll also include any interesting media I consumed for the episode. Email questions or quibbles will reach me at thehistoryofamericanfood@gmail.com. A few words to review this podcast on your favorite podcast widget like Good Pods, Podchaser, or whatever you use really does make a difference, and it helps me make sure I'm heading in an interesting direction. Associated food pictures find their way up on Instagram at @THOAFood. Music for this podcast is Fingerlympics by Dr. Turtle. The link to the show notes is also in the show's Twitter bio at THOAFood and in the show description.